In this video, we'll be talking about how to use an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer can be found over here. I have my windows set to Essentials, so if you have the same thing, you'll see them here. If you don't see them, look under Window, and you can find it and open it this way. What an adjustment layer does is it affects the layers that are underneath it. And each of these icons represents a different way that you can affect what's going on underneath. So let's say I have this image, which is actually really nicely edited. There's not really much I could do to it to make it better. But let's say I want to play around with it and try some different styles. You notice down here there are lots of different ways, and many of these you probably won't really need to worry too much about. Let's try just a couple of them. Let's say photo filter. I want to put a photo filter on this just to warm it up a little bit. And what you notice is that this is just a nice little bit of warming filter. So photographers, you might recognize some of these filters. You might see some of these that you would put on a camera, like a red filter, magenta, sepia, deep red, and so forth. So you could actually change the overall color contrast and the overall color look. You can even go so far as to change the color itself. So you might start with something like this deep blue, and you could affect it. You could change it, make it a little less saturated. You could go green, full-on deep green, or something like that. So you really do have a lot of option. As you change something like the density, you can make it less intense, or you can push it really, really far, so you get a really deep saturation in these colors. Now, of course, that's not a great effect, but this is nice if I want to just change the general mood for this image. Now, let's go ahead and close that up. You notice the properties opens up when you do that, and you can always change those properties. So if I have this layer selected, I can go into my properties menu here. And again, if you don't see that, properties would be over here. If you're setting this for Essentials, then you'll see properties up here. And I could change it back, right? So I could go back to deep blue, I could change it to underwater, I could change it to any of these particular colors that I want it to be. What's nice about Photoshop is that as it has developed as a program, it has been designed to help photographers and illustrators and artists to not permanently alter their work. So you can always go back in, and the work that you've done, if you use Photoshop, well, it never goes away. So if I wanted to, I could get rid of this photo filter and all of the original image is still there. It hasn't been changed permanently. And this is a wonderful feature. It means that you have so much flexibility with this program. So I can use this photo filter, or I can get rid of it. I can double click in here if I wanted to, and I can change it again. And I have this option of being able to change it as many times as I want and never permanently alter the original image. Okay, so that is just photo filter. That's one of the more subtle ones. And usually what you have at the top are going to be more useful, and what you have at the bottom are going to be less useful, and you'll be less likely to use them. So let's start up here with something like levels, which is usually a very, very good tool to be using. Now you can see from this thing, this is called the histogram. And the histogram basically tells us where the information is in this image. So this point represents black, this represents middle gray, and this represents white. So there's a lot of information in the dark region, decent amount as it tapers off to the midtones, and then very little in the lights. Now what you notice is if I take these sliders and move them, I actually increase the contrast. So as I bring these together, I can really push that contrast far, but you notice that everything that's basically here from middle gray up to white has been blown out. It has been knocked into just white. So that's usually not something you really want to do if you want to get the effect of really intense light. This is how you could get that. But you've got to be careful because these pixels are getting blown out. All the information is getting diluted, and we would end up losing a lot of that information. Conversely, if you wanted to start with the darks, you could go from the darks and move your way up to the light, and you could bring both of these together just to create more contrast. You can see that as you push these really close together, you get to something that's approaching just straight black and white. If I made this layer and I got to something that was okay, but maybe not exactly what I want. I could always just delete this layer. So now if I press delete, it actually wants to delete the layer mask, but I want to delete the whole thing, so I click on that layer again. Delete layer 1 levels, yes. So again, you have that flexibility that if you create an adjustment layer that you decide that you don't want, you're not obliged to it. You can always remove it, and you can always take it away. The other one that's useful in here is curves. Curves is similar, but it shows you that histogram and gives you a more subtle way of changing it. So if I pull my whites in here, pull my blacks in here, I'm doing the exact same thing I did with levels. I can actually go the opposite way, and I can make my darks lighter and my lights darker and create something that's a little bit more grayed out. And you can actually fine-tune how that looks by creating curves within this. Now, this is one of those tools that the more complex you make it, usually the worse off it is. So something simple like a nice S-curve is usually a good approach. Another really nice thing you can do with this, since this adjustment layer is creating a new layer, you can actually affect it like you would any other layer. So I can actually take the opacity and knock it down. So if I've created an effect that's close, but I want it to be a little less intense, I could just take that opacity down. You can actually change the blend modes for these as well, which will create different effects as well. And some of these can be useful at different times, depending on the adjustment layer that you're using. So it's just something to keep in mind as you study Photoshop, that this is a possibility. Okay, let's talk about hue saturation. This is a nice one to be able to use. And basically it changes the colors of the image. It does it in a pretty intense way. This is actually kind of fun. So I've pushed everything over into this magenta family, and the colors change in correspondence to each other. So this gives it a little bit more of a fall look. I can increase the saturation, which will take all of the colors and increase their saturation. Be careful with that. And you can also increase lightness, which sometimes is handy. This little button is really good to know about. This is colorize. So if I press colorize, I'm taking all of those pixels, basically converting it to something like a black and white, and then applying a hue on top of it. So it starts with this kind of red tone, and then I can move it more into the sepias. I can increase the saturation if I really want to. Sometimes it helps to increase the lightness if you want to see that color a little bit more clearly, if you're really pushing the saturation effect. And you can get something pretty intense like this. If you're going for something that's more of a sepia tone, you usually want that saturation to be down here in the thirds range or so. Depending on the image, you might have that lightness down. And then this kind of reddish orange color gives you a nice sepia effect. So if you want like an old time look, this is how you could get that. Alright, let's close that up. I'm just going to hide that layer. I'll hide this layer too so we can still see our original image. And these will give you some more options. Exposure for you photographers, this will give you some exposure effect. Vibrance is nice because what vibrance does, it will increase saturation in colors that are already more saturated, and it won't increase the saturation so much in the neutral areas, right? So saturation itself will increase all of it. So even these gray areas down here, it's increasing the saturation. Whereas vibrance is really going to focus more on the areas that are already vibrant, so that creates a more natural effect. So vibrance is usually a better choice than saturation, but it's good to know that there's a difference between those two, and in this adjustment layer you can adjust both. One more to talk about. Let's look at black and white. In black and white, basically what it does is it converts it into a black and white image. Okay, now why is this nice? This is more than something that would happen with just desaturate. You could do this by coming up to Image, Adjustments, and then you could go to Desaturate right here. Now it's not available because we're looking at this adjustment layer. But what this does is it actually gives you some control. So let's say I like this image, but I want to pull these details out a little bit more. I could take those greens and I could actually increase them. So now I have this contrast. Because I'm taking the greens and making them lighter, I'm making this more contrasted and making that part of the image a little bit more interesting. Now sometimes you don't know which to click on, so you can use this hand you can find an area, so let's say this green, and then I select and click and drag on it. Now you can see it's taking the greens because this is moving. It's taking those greens and it's increasing them. Let's say I want to try the sky and see if I could knock that down a little bit. So it's actually grabbing the cyans and it's decreasing those. And you can see the slider move as I click and drag up here. So this is a nice tool because it does something more than what just desaturating would do. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. Let's pick this layer and go to Image Adjustments, Desaturate, and unclick this so I can see what happens. This is just a straightforward desaturation. It takes all the color out of it. Now the problem is I've changed all those pixels, so I can't get back to where that was. If I were to save this and open it and come back to it, I've lost that information. So before I do that, I can actually go back in my history panel, get to what I had, and not lose that information. So this, again, this is nice. This is non-destructive editing, which is a very good approach. And it also gives me more control because I was able to pull these nice green leaves out and create a little bit more interest in this corner than I would have if I just desaturated the image. Okay. There are more of these, of course, but the scope of this course is to not overwhelm you with information. Now, if you feel like that's a great place to play, I by all means encourage you to go and explore some of these and see what they do, right? Each of these will give you something different. Each of them will give you a different effect. Some of them may not make sense, but it is fun to play around and to see what actually happens with some of these different adjustment layers. And again, remember, they're non-committal. If you create an adjustment layer that doesn't quite do what you want, you can always get rid of it. You're never obliged to have it, so feel free to play around with them to see what happens and explore adjustment layers. Now I'd like to show you a couple extra things to think about with adjustment layers. So what I've done is I've brought in this velociraptor and I want to connect him into this environment, and I'm going to try to use adjustment layers to help me out. Now on this layer in this forest, I've created this deep red photo filter, and you can tell this guy just looks so out of place here. Well, I like this photo filter, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag and bring it down to this layer button. And now it's actually made two of them. Now look what's happening is it's making both of these really red because it's basically multiplying this effect. So all I have to do is bring it up here to affect layer 2. Okay. Now notice what is happening here is this little arrow is making it affect just this, and that is called a clipping mask. So if you don't see that, all you have to do is hold down Option between the layers and click, or Alt on a PC, hold down Alt. And the other thing that you can do is you can make sure you check in your properties, and you'll see that here as well. So this little square with the arrow pointing down means that it'll clip it. And again, what that means is this layer is only going to affect this particular layer, my velociraptor layer. If I remove that, now it's affecting both layers. Since I have this filter here already, it's doubling up on this one and it's going to make it look wrong. Now I could get rid of this one and just make it affect this layer, but either way, it's something you want to be aware of. You do have this option to clip. Now let me show you where it's going to be a little bit more appropriate. So I have this layer and I've created this curves layer to try to make his tonality match this space a little bit more. And all I have to do is click on curves. I'm going to make sure that this clips just to this velociraptor. You can see that arrow indicating it's a clipping layer. And he needs to be a little bit darker. The brightness seems okay. It doesn't need to really be brighter. I think these parts are as bright as they need to be. And I'm going to put a couple of points in here that I can adjust. So I can pull some of these darks down a little bit. Maybe I'll put one more in here, because there's some midtones in here that I want to be a little darker. I don't want so much reflected light coming up on him. And I think that's basically in this range. Sometimes, if you don't know, you can use this and you can find what that area is, and you can increase it or decrease it. Notice that it puts a point in your curves. I'm going to move this around just to have a little bit more control. And be careful, the stronger you make those curves, sometimes you can make those values jump a little bit far, and you can see that in here. It almost creates a posterization effect. So I don't want to overdo that. I'm going to pull this out just a little bit more so it's not so deep and dark. And just pull some of this, maybe to about there. So that seems pretty good. He looks a little bit more connected to this environment. Let's go ahead and close that up, and notice again I've got that clipping layer, so it's only affecting this. If it weren't doing that, then it would affect all of that space around it, and it would make this background too dark. So I don't want that. I want to make sure that those curves are only affecting this particular layer. And notice how this photo filter is helping to unite that. So the colors are a little bit more controlled, they're a little bit more united, and it feels like it's a more unified scene. It has a little bit more realism to it. If I were to add in a little shadow in here, it wouldn't really be too bad. It'd actually have a little bit of a sense of realism to it. So that is how you can use clipping layers to your advantage.